In 186 BC, the Roman Senate passed one of the most aggressive pieces of legislation in the Republic's history. It wasn't aimed at an invading army. It wasn't a response to famine or plague or political assassination. It was aimed at a wedding ritual, the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, the Senate's decree against the Bacchanalian rites, ordered the destruction of sacred sites across Italy, banned gatherings of more than 5 people connected to these ceremonies, and made participation punishable by death. Roman authorities arrested thousands, executed hundreds, dismantled shrines that had stood for generations, and then, with the systematic thoroughness that Rome applied to everything it wanted gone, they rewrote the record so completely that most of what those rituals actually involved had to be reconstructed by historians working from fragments, accusations, and the archaeological evidence that survived buried in the ground. What were they so afraid of? That question, followed carefully across 3 continents and several centuries, leads somewhere Rome never wanted anyone to look. Because the wedding rituals Rome suppressed, the Celtic sacred unions, the Egyptian rites of Isis, the Eastern mystery traditions woven into marriage ceremonies across the ancient world, shared something in common. Something Rome identified as a structural threat, not just a religious difference. Something that, once you understand it, explains not just what Rome destroyed, but why it worked so hard to make sure nobody remembered. This is the part that didn't make it into the history books. Start with what Roman marriage actually was, not the romantic version, the legal version. Because Roman marriage was, at its foundation, a property transfer mechanism with ceremonial decoration. The word matrimonium derives from mater, mother, but the institution it described had almost nothing to do with the woman at its center. Roman marriage transferred a woman from her father's legal authority, the patria potestas, into either her husband's authority or remained technically under her father's control depending on the form of marriage used. Either way, she moved from one man's legal ownership to another's. Her consent was required in later Roman law technically. Her enthusiasm was not. The ceremony reflected this. Roman weddings involved contracts, witnesses, financial negotiations, and an auspex, a reader of omens, who confirmed the day was favorable. The bride wore a specific flame-colored veil, the flammeum, which signified the transfer. She was escorted from her father's house to her husband's house in a procession. The threshold crossing was ceremonially significant. The groom carried her over it. Because the threshold represented the legal boundary between his household and the outside world. She was entering his legal domain. The ritual made that transfer visible. There was almost nothing in the official Roman marriage ceremony about the woman's inner life, her spiritual state, her relationship to the divine, or her autonomous personhood. Now compare that to what Rome spent 3 centuries systematically destroying. The Celts did not have a single unified wedding ritual. The Celtic world stretched from Ireland to Anatolia, encompassing dozens of distinct tribal cultures with their own variations. But the practices that Roman sources document, always with a tone of horror that tells you more about Rome's anxiety than about the rituals themselves, share a consistent structure that is almost the precise inverse of what Rome considered proper. Celtic marriage recognized multiple forms of union, graduated by legal status and duration. The Irish Brehon laws, which survived the Roman conquest in Ireland and were eventually written down in the medieval period, preserving pre-Roman traditions, describe 9 distinct categories of marriage partnership, ranging from permanent unions of equal property contribution to temporary seasonal bonds. A woman could initiate divorce. A woman could own property independently within a marriage. A woman who brought more cattle to a union than her husband held greater legal authority within it. But it was the ritual dimension that Rome found most threatening. Celtic sacred unions, what Roman sources call with deliberate contempt confariatio barbarica, barbaric joining, were conducted not by a civic official or a property lawyer, but by a druid. And the druid's role in the ceremony was not to witness a legal transfer. It was to invoke the land itself as a participant in the union. The Celtic sacred marriage was, in its theological structure, a 3-way bond between 2 people and the earth they stood on. The ceremony took place outdoors, in specific landscape features, near springs, at the base of particular trees, on hillsides with sight lines to specific horizon points. The location was not incidental decoration. The location was a party to the agreement. Caesar documented the Druids with a mixture of fascination and strategic assessment. He wanted to understand what he was destroying. He noted that Druidic authority in Celtic society exceeded that of warriors and kings in certain domains, particularly in the domain of sacred contracts. A marriage conducted under Druidic rites carried a weight that Roman civil marriage simply did not have, because it was witnessed not by human officials, but by something older and less negotiable. Roman legions burned the Druidic groves. That is documented fact. Tacitus describes the assault on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, in 60 CE, where Roman forces destroyed the sacred groves and slaughtered the Druids gathered there with a ferocity that even Tacitus found notable to record. The groves were not military installations, they were the places where these ceremonies happened. Their destruction was targeted. Here's what that tells you. Rome did not burn the groves because Druids were a military threat. Rome burned the groves because the rituals conducted in them encoded a vision of human community, including marriage, that was structurally incompatible with Roman authority. A marriage, witnessed by the land, conducted by a figure whose authority came from something other than Roman law, produced a bond that Roman law could not easily dissolve, tax, regulate, or absorb. It existed outside the system, and things that existed outside the Roman system had a way of becoming the foundations of resistance. Egypt presented a different problem, and in certain ways, a more urgent one. The cult of Isis had spread across the Mediterranean world by the 1st century BC, carried by traders, soldiers, and the irresistible appeal of a goddess whose mythology centered on something Rome's official religion almost entirely lacked: romantic love as a sacred force. Isis had searched the entire world for the body of her murdered husband Osiris. She had reassembled him piece by piece. She had, in the most intimate detail of the myth, restored him enough to conceive their son, Horus. The love between Isis and Osiris was not incidental to their divinity. It was the mechanism of it. Their union was the force that renewed the world. The wedding rituals conducted under Isis's patronage reflected this theology directly. Egyptian sacred marriage, and the Isis-inflected version that spread across the Greek and Roman world, was not primarily a legal event. It was an initiatory one. The couple was understood to be, during the ceremony, enacting the reunion of Isis and Osiris. They were standing in for the divine couple. The ritual was designed to invoke in the participants the felt experience of sacred union, not just the legal fact of it. This required a different kind of ceremony entirely. The rites of Isis involved water from the Nile, or, as the cult spread, water symbolically consecrated to represent it. Ritual bathing, the exchange of specific words understood to invoke divine presence. A priestess rather than a male official conducting the ceremony, and most significantly, an explicit theology of the woman's spiritual authority within the union. Isis was not a passive figure. She was the active agent of the myth. She was the one who searched, who gathered, who restored, who conceived. The ritual encoded that agency into the marriage ceremony itself. Rome banned the Isis cult repeatedly. Augustus expelled it from the city in 28 BC. Tiberius banned it again in 19 CE, demolishing her temple and throwing her statue into the Tiber. The Senate legislated against it multiple times. Devotees were arrested, their ritual objects destroyed, their meeting places dismantled. It kept coming back, because you cannot legislate away a need. The women of Rome, and the women across the Roman world, kept finding their way to the Isis ceremonies because those ceremonies gave them something Roman marriage law structurally denied them: a ritual context in which their inner life, their spiritual experience, their autonomous agency as a partner rather than a transferred property, was not just acknowledged, but made sacred. That is what Rome kept trying to destroy, and that is why it kept failing. The Eastern mystery traditions present the most complex case because they arrived in Rome not as a foreign invasion but as an attraction. The cult of Cybele from Phrygia. The rites of Adonis from Syria. The sacred marriage traditions from Babylon that filtered westward through Hellenistic culture. Each of these carried, embedded within larger religious frameworks, a vision of the union between human beings that was fundamentally different from Rome's transactional model. The Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage, was one of the oldest religious concepts in the ancient Near East. It appears in Sumerian texts thousands of years before Rome existed. In its original form, it described the ritual union of a god and goddess, enacted by human representatives, a king and a priestess, as the mechanism by which divine fertility was transferred to the land. By the time these traditions reached the Roman world, they had evolved considerably, but the core theological claim remained that the union of two people could, under the right ritual conditions, participate in something divine. That marriage was not just a legal contract, but a sacred act with cosmic significance. Roman official religion had nothing equivalent to this. The Roman pantheon included married gods, certainly Jupiter and Juno, whose marriage was notably terrible and used primarily as a cautionary tale in Roman literature. But Roman religion did not teach that human marriage was a participation in divine reality. It was a civic duty, a mechanism of social reproduction. Properly managed, it produced legitimate children who would become Roman citizens and continue the system. The mystery traditions said something else entirely. They said that in the moment of sacred union, something real happened between the human and the divine. That the ceremony, conducted correctly, was not a symbol of something but an actual event in which the participants were transformed. This was intolerable to Rome for a reason that goes deeper than religious competition. A woman who understood her marriage as a sacred initiation, who had been through a ceremony designed to invoke her participation in divine reality, was a woman whose primary loyalty was to something Rome could not regulate. Her marriage was witnessed by a goddess. Her bond was ratified by forces that Roman law could not supersede. She had an internal authority, a sense of her own sacred standing that existed entirely outside the Roman system of male guardianship and legal ownership. And authority that exists outside the Roman system is, by definition, dangerous to the Roman system. Here is the mechanism Rome used to erase these traditions, because it is more sophisticated than simple prohibition and more revealing than anything else in this history. Rome did not only ban the foreign rituals, it absorbed them, partially, selectively, with surgical precision, incorporating the elements that were compatible with Roman authority and destroying the elements that were not. The Isis cult is the clearest example. After centuries of attempted suppression that repeatedly failed, Rome eventually incorporated Isis into the official pantheon, but as a transformed figure. The Roman Isis kept the iconography, the throne, the sistrum, the nursing pose with Horus that would later directly influence Christian Madonna iconography. What she lost was the theology of female agency that her original cult encoded. The Roman Isis was a protective mother figure. She was not the active, searching, world-restoring force of the Egyptian original. The ritual context that had given Roman women a framework for understanding their own sacred authority was quietly removed in the process of official adoption. The Celtic sacred marriage traditions were absorbed through a similar process, more violent in its first stage and more thorough in its eventual execution. As Rome Christianized, the church that spread through Celtic territories made a systematic effort to incorporate local sacred sites, building churches on Druidic groves, converting sacred springs into Christian holy wells, reframing local seasonal ceremonies as Christian feast days. The sacred trees where Celtic marriages had been conducted became the churchyards where Christian marriages were now required to be registered. The location remained. The theology that had made the location sacred was replaced entirely. What looks like continuity was actually substitution. Rome, and the Roman Church that carried the imperial project forward after the Western Empire fell, understood that the most effective way to destroy a practice was not always to prohibit it, but to hollow it out. to keep the vessel and replace the contents, to preserve the form while removing the meaning. The women who had been married under the rites of Isis, who had stood at Druidic groves and made bonds witnessed by the land, who had participated in Hieros Gamos ceremonies that located their union within cosmic significance. Their granddaughters attended ceremonies that looked superficially similar but contained something fundamentally different. Not a theology of female agency and sacred participation. A theology of male oversight, ecclesiastical authority, and the Church as the only legitimate mediator between the human and the divine. What does this tell us about Rome? And what does it tell us about something larger? It tells us that Rome understood, with a sophistication that its brutality sometimes obscures, the relationship between ritual and political authority. The wedding ceremony is not just a celebration. It is a teaching. It encodes, in the most emotionally heightened moment of a person's life, a specific understanding of what a marriage is, who the parties are, what their relationship is to each other and to the community witnessing them. Conduct that ceremony under the authority of a druid who invokes the land, and you produce citizens whose deepest emotional memories locate them in a web of relationships that includes the non-human world and exists outside state control. Conduct that ceremony under a Roman magistrate who records a property transfer, and you produce citizens whose deepest emotional memories locate them firmly inside the Roman system. This is why Rome burned the groves. Not because druids were dangerous soldiers, because the ceremonies conducted in those groves produced people who understood themselves in ways that made Roman authority over them fundamentally less complete. The same logic applied to the Isis rites, to the mystery traditions, to every Eastern practice that Rome systematically suppressed and then absorbed and then hollowed out. The content of the ritual was not the target. The self-understanding the ritual produced was the target. You can pass laws about property. You cannot pass laws about how a woman understands her own sacred standing in the universe. What you can do is burn the places where she learned it. And Rome, with extraordinary thoroughness across 5 centuries of empire, did exactly that. The sacred springs are still there in Britain. Archaeologists find the votive offerings at the bottom of them. Coins, pins, small figurines, left by women making prayers that the official record does not preserve. The offerings are still coming up out of the ground. Some of them date to the period of Roman occupation. Some of them are earlier. Some of them are later, left after Rome had already told those women that the spring was no longer sacred. They left their offerings anyway. That detail, small as it is, contains the whole story.